Chapter Spooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapter Spooks, where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. And today, we've got a frustrating book in the Bone Chillers series. And, I'm going to start things off, compliment sandwich. You start with something nice. I think it's going to have to be an open sandwich, because I don't know if there's something to end with, but we'll start with something nice. So we've got ourselves a new ghostwriter for this book, Sherry Shahan. Now, whilst this book was not a very good example of her writing talents, I did look up some of the other books that she's written, and they not only sound interesting, but I found some excerpts of them. And she is a good writer, especially when it comes to writing these interesting novels, which is all about sort of a teen drama thing. But it seems like whenever she does these books that are chapter spooks books, horror middle grade type things, chapter books, they're just not good. And to explain why, well, we're going to be going through the book piece by piece, but my first issue has to be that the title of this book is blowtorch at psycho.com. Now, that's a fun title. I think I've said before, I like these silly titles even when they're a little bit stupid. But I quite like that one, especially because, psycho.com, that's a bit silly, that's gone a bit far, but I really like blowtorch at psycho, because to me, obviously you could just have, madman at psycho, or killer at psycho, but to me, blowtorch is leaning towards this idea of it's horrifying and crazy because it's a psycho with a blowtorch, but there's something there about, arson, about burning, about fire. That's an interesting way to take this fear so that you've already got a bit of a plot developing just from that title. An email address from a person who's a psycho with blowtorch. That's kind of interesting. What could the story be about? This story takes all of that potential, chewed it up, and spat it in my face. That's how it felt reading this book, because so much of this just doesn't make sense. There's all these surreal things going on. The plot, at the one hand, is so overly simple, and yet at the same time is so convoluted that it just doesn't make any sense. And I think the best way to explain that is to go through the summary. I'm going to try to get through this quickly and as painlessly as I possibly can, but we're going to have to talk about this one. So let's get into the summary of Bone Chillers number 18, blowtorch at psycho.com. So we're introduced to our main character, Jason, who is picking his fingernails. Okay, that's not too fair. They make a stupid joke about it, but he's thinking because he's working on a story for school. Apparently there's some contest going on at school where if you write the best story and it's judged to be number 1 or in the top 3, then you will get your story along with the other winners published in an actual book. And our kid is obsessing about this. They say that he is crazy for writing horror stories. He's got so many book jackets on posters that have been blown up and plastered all around his room. He's even got a signed, autographed picture of Stephen King. And his best friend at school bought him a book that's all about writing by a guy called J. Jim Jam, which seems odd seeing as how Stephen King wrote on writing. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that he is obsessed with writing. That's his character. He's obsessed with writing. And so we start off with him saying, okay, maybe he's a creepy crook. No, that's not creative enough. I'm going to call him a super bad dude. And I get that he's a kid. Right? I get that he's a kid. Kids aren't the best writers in the world. But it's not just him that seems to get writing wrong. It's also, ironically, the writer of this book, because she says that he read that book his friend got him by J. Jim Jam, and in it said that you need to have well-rounded characters, and it says well-rounded characters need to have flaws. And so the flaw that he gives blowtorch is that he's allergic to beans. And onions and cheese as well, I guess. I think the idea is he's allergic to beans, but he also doesn't like the cheese and onions because they give him really bad gas. And not to preempt my writer's advice stuff early, but you'd think that with a character whose main character trait is that he's a murderer, that instead of giving him a flaw, because the flaw is the fact that he's a killer, you might give him a positive trait to sort of balance that out. But this isn't even actual writing advice. This is just because we're telegraphing that the main character guy here, blowtorch, has a weakness. But hey, a page after we learn about this, then his dad comes in the room and he says that his mum made him a special snack because she, wanted to keep his energy up. Because this kid has literally been using up all of his weekends just in his room writing, doing research, all this stuff. So he offers him a burrito, and there's a little exchange about him saying, "Oh man, if you get it in a book, I'd love an autographed copy," sort of, encouraging his kid. I do appreciate that. But our kid then, he gets the snack, and the snack turns out to be a bean-filled burrito. And what else is in it? It's got Swiss cheese and onions. What could this mean? And that's not just me being overly dramatic. Chapter 2 literally starts with a sentence. Jason tried to use logic to explain away the bean burrito. What? What? But that scene is interrupted when Cambria comes in. This is a girl who's obsessed with skating. She's got curly copper-colored hair, and she's basically saying there's a new ramp that somebody built out on the street, so she wants to go skating. And our kid's like, "Oh, I don't know what's going on." He's like, "Should I tell her about the burrito?" Because, of course, he's still worried about this stupid burrito. But he seems pretty keen. He thinks maybe he should work on his story later, so he's like, "Yeah, okay, well, I'll just save this and I'll come out." But then... And this is the inciting incident for the story, by the way. He turns to his computer and it spits out sparks. For no reason. Suddenly, the computer screen turned primrose pink. It was the same color as the hairdryer at the crime scene. Sparks flew off the screen and landed on Jason's notes, threatening to burn them to a crisp. Jason slapped at the paper, but small holes had already burned black dots into the sheets on top. "Did you see that?" he asked, wide-eyed. "What?" she said casually, turning from the window. "What do you mean, what? The computer! The screen!" He waved the singed paper as evidence. "The sparks!" "It's okay if you want to work on your story instead of going to the park," Cambria punctuated her remark by popping her gum. "All you have to do is say so." "The computer must have a glitch," he said, thinking out loud. "Maybe it's about to crash, or maybe there's a power surge in the neighborhood. Either way, I'd better print out the last scene. Go on without me." "A bunch of parents are building a jumping ramp. I can't wait to try it." Cambria swiveled on her paisley patterned sneakers. "Try to come over later, okay?" Jason nodded without answering. With the contest only 2 weeks away, a meltdown was all he needed. He punched a few keys, commanding the computer to print the last draft. "Come on," he muttered impatiently. "Hurry up." The printer started spitting out pages. Jason quickly reread the scene that showed Blowtorch bribing a guard with cold, hard cash. In exchange, Blowtorch could have a prison computer in his cell. According to the latest outline, Blowtorch would use the computer to tap into the prison library system and work on his appeal. His strategy? Blowtorch planned to frame his mum for the hairdryer murder. Jason glanced at the pages. "Hey, what's going on?" He read them over again, but the words remained the same. Instead of using the computer for research, Blowtorch had tapped into a program called Pen Pal. "That was the first draft of my story," Jason stared unblinking at the paper. "I deleted those pages last week." Jason flipped through the yellow pad that held his new outline just to make sure. "See?" He shoved his notes at the computer as if the screen could read. "No Pen Pal program." Jason slumped in his chair. Did he forget to dump the first draft? Did he forget to enter the new version? No way. He shook his head. He might be a bit scatterbrained, but he wasn't crazy. Jason highlighted the section about Pen Pal and hit delete. Nothing happened. The words stared at him from the screen, as if challenging him. He highlighted the same section and dragged it to the trash can. He hit dump trash and waited. Still nothing. Before you ask, no, I didn't skip anything. That was page 10. You didn't miss the scene where something magical happened and made it work that way, or that something cursed him, or that he downloaded a virus. No, none of that happened. The computer just randomly came to life, spat sparks, and now it's misbehaving. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, well, buckle up, because the rest of the book is like that. Because after Cambria leaves, he then decides that he's been working on this story too much. He decides to do his homework instead, so he starts doing his homework. He lies on his bed, but he must fall asleep because he's awoken when his mum comes in saying that it's time for dinner. And for dinner, they're having chili. And if that's not terrifying enough, his mum then walks out of the room and screams. And if that seems weird, don't worry, it's because that whole last little section was a dream. Turns out that wasn't real. His mum didn't actually come in and offer him chili. Oh, but the screaming was real, because that kid then wakes up and gets out of bed to see that the reason his mum was screaming is because she's in the bathroom and his dad cut himself shaving. And yeah, there's blood everywhere. It's a bit of a gruesome looking sight, but what really makes our kid scared is that he sees that his dad cut himself just under his eye, which to him doesn't make a lot of sense to be shaving a cut under your eye, especially because that cut under his eye is right where the scar should be on Blowtorch's face. And yeah, I forgot to mention that earlier, but you should expect something like that. It's the most cliched, he's a convict, he's got a scar on his face, he's got a grim, bald head. But more importantly, because his dad cut himself shaving and got blood all over his shirt, he then takes off his clean white shirt and replaces it with a pinstriped shirt with beige and blue lines, which, according to the kid, look exactly like the prison uniform that Blowtorch is wearing. And when they go to eat breakfast, instead of having the nice porcelain plates, his mum gives his dad a cup of coffee in a metal mug, and the plates have been replaced by smooth, round metal plates, like in prison. And when I read that, I thought, okay, so is the kid still dreaming? Is this a double fake out? But no, it's not a double fake out, because our kid then goes on the phone to call up Canberra and say, hey, I need me to talk to you about something weird is going on. And he then goes and meets her in front of school, and they head to school. So all that stuff happened, and then there's this long drawn out scene where he wants to tell her, but he keeps hemming and hawing, and so at first they're distracted because he and Cambria meet on the corner in front of the firehouse, and another girl called Barbara Burton, although our kids all call her BB, she apparently has a huge crush on Jason, and so he finds her annoying. And so there's a scene where she interrupts, and she's like, hey, what's going on? And he doesn't want to say it in front of her. And so they end up having to ditch her, and they race off to school. And this scene, as well as the one where we introduce Cambria, both scenes introducing female characters are weirdly clipped. But what matters is that both the kids race off to school ahead of BB, and when they get there, Jason finally tells Cambria about some of the stuff that's going on. His dad cut his eye right where the scar was, and they've got weird metal plates, and the striped shirt. And Cambria, thankfully the voice of reason, just explains, well, this is all just coincidence, surely. There's plenty of reasons why someone would eat with metal plates. Maybe they were testing out camping gear before they used it out in the wild. Maybe your dad just owns striped shirts. Wow, shock horror. And he cut himself shaving. Well, it's an accident. Obviously, accidents don't have to be neat and tidy. I don't understand what you're talking about. So, our kids just head off to class. But then after a half a page description explaining how the teacher, Mr. Glabrous, has trichotillomania, the teacher then hands out all of the letters from the class pen pals, which apparently isn't a thing that anyone remembers. Not only does Jason not know, he turns to the kid beside saying, what's all this about? And he says, I don't know, news to me. So the teacher then hands out these letters, effectively at random, doing the whole, take one, pass it on thing. But the one that gets taken by Jason is a weird envelope which doesn't have any return address or stamp. It's just got an address of the school printed on the front. And for some reason, Jason already feels weird about this. He doesn't feel comfortable. But then he actually opens the letter. It was no use. Jason sucked in his breath and tore into his envelope. He pulled out a piece of computer paper. The edge of the page was dark brown and curled, as if it had been burned. Jason squinted at the words jumping off the page. Dear Jason, I can help you win the short story contest, but first you gotta get me out of here. Your pen pal, Blowtorch. Okay, there's a lot of problems with this. Even setting aside the fact that handing out these letters at random, he got one addressed to him, doesn't make sense. There's so much here that there's some I need to talk about at the end of the summary, but right now, I need to point out the biggest flaw right here, and this is why I say I feel like something spat in my face. This isn't an email. The book is blowtorch@psycho.com. That's an email address. Obviously, he needs to get in contact with the bad guy via email, and yet he's getting a printed out page handed to him in class? What? Why? Why would you do that? What? Why can't you just have the message sent to him over email? That gets rid of the whole stupid random thing, how it's addressed to him, even though it was handed to him at random thing. It gets rid of this whole idea of how it's something they weren't planning in class and yet it happened anyway. Why couldn't he just get sent? It frustrates me so much. You could fix it so easily. Why would you do that? This isn't even a why I quit the Babysitters Club situation where it's crossing the line. It's just an email, and it makes more sense than a letter. It makes more sense to kids. This was written in the 90s. Kids understand email. Why would you do this? Why would you do this? And this is followed by him and Cambria. After they leave the class, he wants to show her the letter, but he messes up because in an earlier scene, I didn't mention because it doesn't matter, he got a little love note from BB, because like I said, she got a crush on him, and he scrunches it up and like throws it away instead. And then when he goes to talk to Cambria, he goes to show her the letter, but he accidentally shows her the letter from BB, which doesn't make any sense, because he didn't crumple up the letter. So how could you not tell the difference between a wadded up ball of paper and a folded piece of... Doesn't make any sense. But what makes even less sense is that then he decides, oh, okay, I'll go get the letter I must have left in the classroom. He then goes into the classroom, and there's this scene where he sees Mr. Glabrous, the teacher, eating a bean burrito, and it's meant to be scary because the room is filled with gas. Well, okay, the book says gas. Obviously they mean he's farting. So he walks into a classroom full of farts and his teacher eating a bean burrito and laughing. And it's less scary and more just ridiculous. And I feel like an idiot for having to explain this, but bean burritos aren't scary. Like, sure, you could make something like that scary in context if you actually develop the... we'll talk about that at the end of the summary as well. I just want to get through this. So, the reason Jason was doing all that was because he wanted to find this letter because he wants to prove to Cambria that he's not crazy. He's seeing something strange happen, and he thinks the best way to do this would be to take her to his computer at home and show her what he saw, that he tried to type something and he tried to delete the old words and they wouldn't change. So he talks to her and convinces her, after a bit of hemming and hawing, to go to his house, skip school, go to his house, and he'll show her that something weird is going on with his story. You know what, this scene's actually kind of alright, so I'm going to give you a good excerpt from the book. Jason slid into the chair at his desk. Wait till you see this. He turned on the computer and clicked on blowtorch burns buns. Then he scrolled to the scene that showed blowtorch entering data into his computer. In my story, blowtorch uses his computer to tap into the prison library system, Jason explained. Cambria leaned over his shoulder, eyeing the screen. He's supposed to be working on his appeal. So, she huffed through Cocoa Rice Crinkle's breath. Blowtorch changed it all around. Instead of trying to frame his mother for the murder, he's in a program called Pen Pal. Get it? Pen Pal, just like in English class. Cambria scooted over a chair. Come on, Jason, that's just a coincidence. A character can't change a story. It's not like he's real or anything. Oh yeah? Just wait. The words on the screen showed Blowtorch in his cell, hunkered studiously over his computer. He was surrounded by thick volumes of law books and was wearing wire-rimmed reading glasses. Hey, said Jason. What's going on? What do you mean, what? She asked. He's working on his appeal, just like he's supposed to be. Cambria raised an eyebrow. Jason, have you been getting enough sleep lately? No. I mean, yes. Jason slowly shook his head to unscramble his brain. You type in something, then try to save it. Blowtorch will change it all around. Go ahead and try, you'll see. What do you want me to say? Anything. Cambria sighed. She giggled and her fingers clicked across the keyboard. Roses are red, violets are blue, BB the brat has a crush on you. Very funny, said Jason. Now quit and try to save it. Cambria clicked on quit, the screen flashed. Save changes before quitting. She clicked yes. Jason stared at the computer. Hurry up, he muttered. Jason hated waiting. It was like waiting for a teacher to call your name to give an oral report. Then she called someone else's name and you had to wait all over again. Nothing was worse than waiting. Finally, the screen blackened. Okay, he said. Start it up again. More waiting. Lunch period will be over in 20 minutes, she said, glancing at her watch. And I can't be late for health class. I'm in charge of the happy hormone display, and I still have to fill the water balloons. Water balloons? It's how I'm illustrating growth, she said, with different amounts of water. Just wait until you see what happens, okay? The screen lit up. Jason sucked in a deep breath. Then he punched up his story. Blowtorch was still hunkered over his computer, still working on his appeal. Jason read the words on his screen. Roses are red, violets are blue. No! Cambria rolled her eyes. This isn't funny anymore, Jason, she said. We cut lunch for nothing. Now we have to sneak back into school. If we get caught, we'll get detention after school for a week, and I'll miss the whole wheelie demo at the skateboard park. Jason was speechless. He stared blankly at the screen. Besides that whole weird, pointless bit of prose about waiting, this is not a bad scene. The kid's actually trying this stuff out. He's seeing it's real. Followed by the classic Cassandra Truth fake-out, which gets even worse for Jason because he tries to show her all of the metal plates and the cups, but when he goes searching through the kitchen, it's all as it should be. White porcelain plates, knives and forks with yellow plastic handles. He even searches the laundry hamper for his dad's bloodstained shirt, but he can't find any of it. And this whole scene ends with a brief fake-out that they go, oh no, someone's home. And it turns out, yeah, there is someone's home. It's his mum, but she's not mad or anything. She's like, shouldn't you be at school? and when they explain that they were getting some stuff for school, the short story, she offers them a lift back to school. And then there's also a little brief moment how she invites Cambria to Jason's birthday because it's February and he was born on the 29th, and so it's actually his actual birthday because every 4 years, leap year thing. And so they've got a big celebration planned for it. And I bring this up for 2 reasons. First of all, when they get back to school, we'll then just get a time jump and we'll just go straight to his birthday. So, yeah, weird transition there. But also, there's a slight implication, I think only one character mentions it once, that maybe the reason why some of this magic stuff has happened is because it's his birthday, and it's one of the special leap year birthdays where it's his actual birthday. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but the rest of this book doesn't make sense anyway, especially as we're getting into the big, crazy, surreal scene. Oh, but before the whole big scene begins, we start at the night before, because after all these days worrying about all this stuff, he's starting to think, you know what, I think I've been worrying too much about this. Maybe it is all in my head. So let's just start thinking of this less like Blowtorch is some bad guy. It's just a story. I could just work on the story. So he develops the next scene in his head because he's in prison, and so he thinks, okay, so the next scene is that Blowtorch is going to get out of prison, but I wonder how he's going to do that. So he imagines him crawling through the heating ducts, and of course then he'd have to get rid of his prison clothes, so we'd have to steal some civilian clothes, hotwire a van. Yeah, that's a good idea. So he'll escape like that. Okay, so he thinks, okay, well, after my birthday, I'll write that into my story, because that sounds exciting. So, satisfied that he's come up with a good plot idea, he goes to sleep. So, it's Jason's birthday, Cambria's there with his mum and dad, and his mum says, oh, I've got a surprise for you. She goes into a room and she comes out with some red handkerchiefs. At first he doesn't know what's going on, until she then folds them into blindfolds and puts one over his head and says, well, you said you wanted a surprise, so let's get in the car and we'll drive you to your surprise. And our kid is hoping they're going to the circus. Apparently they've seen some flyers up around town advertising the circus. Okay, that's a birthday-ish thing. But when they get to where they're going, she says, okay, take off your blindfold, here's your birthday surprise. They're at the prison. A prison which, by the way, as they say later in the book, this didn't exist before because it's in the middle of downtown. That's not where prisons usually go. But also, in the prison, he looks up at the guard tower and Blowtorch is standing up there, grinning viciously. Blowtorch welcomes them to the prison and even thanks Jason for helping him to escape. Even saying, oh, heating ducts, ingenious plan. But it doesn't make any sense to Jason because he didn't actually write that in the story, but obviously that doesn't matter. What matters is that this seems to have taken over his mum and dad because his dad gives him a present which is a prison uniform, wrapped up in a box with a bow on it, and his mum says, oh, and I baked you a cake with a file in it, because I guess they want to lock him in the prison now, which I don't quite get. But anyway, so Jason and Cambria say, okay, the only way to solve this, we need to get to my house to my computer. So they try running, but this is downtown. There's a highway right there which is going at crazy highway speeds. They can't cross it, so they head to a bus stop. They find a bus stop, and so they catch the bus instead. So they get on the bus, and then moments after it leaves the bus stop, they realize that it's got security windows and the bus driver's wearing a security guard uniform, and he's driving them back to the prison and cackling evilly, and sorry, it annoys me every time I see it because it makes no sense. He also has a lunchbox which Jason thinks, oh, and I bet it's got a bean burrito inside. Just stop. Can we stop with the bean burrito thing? Okay? Anyway, the bus drives them back to the prison, and so they're basically back where they started, but they kick out the emergency exit, and Jason manages to run, and he just bolts so fast, he gets to the middle dividing thing in the middle of the highway before he realizes that Cambria's not with him, and he turns back and sees that she got her shirt caught on the emergency exit handle, which doesn't make sense because they were kicking the door open. Don't worry about it. What matters is that he sees that his friend is caught there, and he's like, oh no, what am I going to do? And then, oh, BB to the rescue, the girl who's got a crush on him. She just walks straight to the middle dividing line from the other side of the road, and all the cars stop instantly. And I love the whole reasoning. He's like, wow, how do you do that? And she says, what are they going to do, hit me? I mean, yeah, that's how a car accident works. But anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is they get to Cambria, they free her from the door, and there's a cute little scene where BB shows that she's actually kind of a badass, because she goes to the bus driver who's trying to grab them and stop them from getting away, and she basically just says, "You can't stop me," and she kicks him in the shins, and they just run away. So the three of them run away and get back to Jason's house. And they see that the bus actually gets to his place first, and so they actually have to sneak around at first because they don't want the bus driver and the weird prison stuff to find them. So they sneak into his place, and Jason has said, okay, we need to destroy the disk on my computer. We need to destroy it. That's going to destroy Blowtorch, because he can change the story, so I can't just rewrite it. I need to destroy him. Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. So they head to his place, and then they waste time searching for Blowtorch or something. Like, they have to search every room for some reason, which doesn't make sense to me. Like, just go straight to the computer. If they're hiding in the house, well, then obviously they're not attacking you straight away. Just go destroy the thing. But whatever. They're padding out this chapter. I mean, it's a pretty short book anyway. So they finally get to the computer, and because apparently we live in a cartoon universe, when he turns it on, he sees like the face of Blowtorch in the screen, and the whole computer is like pulsing and moving as though it's pulsing like a heart, and is thinking. And so then he quickly types something onto the computer. I don't know why he's doing this, because he ends up just moving the whole thing, cutting and pasting it onto a disk, which he then ejects from the computer. And he then snaps it in half, and he hands the pieces, one to Cambria and one to BB, and then they snap it in half, and then they break it up more, and then they go to the kitchen and they drop it in the garbage disposal. So we're done, right? Well, no, because even though that made sense to me, it apparently didn't make sense to the writer, because they say, no, he's not dead. So the bus pulls up into their driveway, which they can see through the kitchen window, and Blowtorch steps out, basically saying, you thought that would defeat me? That's not enough to defeat me. And so he's taunting them, and I love this bit. He's holding something behind his back menacingly. Ooh, what could it be? Is he holding a weapon? And then he reveals a hairdryer, because remember, even though he's called Blowtorch, because he burns things, and Blowtorches burn things, and he's burning his Blowtorch, his weapon of choice is a hairdryer. But what matters is that our kid thinks, I know how to defeat him. So he opens the window and he throws a can of beans at his head. And I could explain that that's not how allergies work. And yes, they will eventually do stuff, but it gets even worse, because then our kid gets an onion and he says, throw the onion down the trash. I guess because that would mix the onion with the disc components. But then they get some cheese out of the fridge, Swiss cheese, because apparently that's the cheese that's not good for him. And he says, rub the cheese all over the computer and the printer. I'm just about done with this book. So, okay, what happens is eventually they realize that that's not enough. They open the beans and they throw them at him. And then Blowtorch, when they finally throw beans at his head and he smells the onion from the house, apparently the smell's enough to affect him, he then has an allergic reaction. But his allergic reaction is that his head starts swelling up like a balloon, so big that they even describe it as like a zeppelin, and he topples over, and his head is punctured by the antenna on the bus, and then deflates like a punctured balloon, making stupid fart noises until he flies around and then drops dead, like his whole body deflates and drops him on the driveway. And yeah, there's more, like the bus turns back in the parents' van, things go back to normal. But I'm done with this book. So that's the end. Where do I even start with this? Actually, you know what? Silly question. I know exactly where to start with this. The title. The title is blowtorch@psycho.com. Where is my blowtorch? Where is my email? This book promised me a maniac with a blowtorch who contacts the main character via email. That's implicit in the title, and yet instead of a blowtorch, we get a hairdryer, and instead of email, we get a letter in class. I don't know if you know this, but those are not the same thing. But that's not even the worst part. To me, the worst part is, what is this surreal bullshit? We had a story about a psycho killer contacting a kid via the email on his computer, and yet you throw in all this weird stuff about how the kid's writing a story that's becoming real, but you don't give any explanation for any of this stuff. Like, I've seen stories do this well. You know what? Not only in several chapter spook stories, but also Are You Afraid of the Dark has several episodes that have these stories that are based on either someone writing a story that's meant to be horrifying, or someone reading a book that's scary that's being written as you write it, whatever. Both of them are sort of metafiction talking about story writing. And in all of those, they tend to be having either a dark fairy tale or a fantasy story with wizards, because at least then you sort of understand that there's magic involved. That's what's causing the books to come to life. It's a magical book. But in this story, there's no explanation for that. It's not even some sort of weird internet thing, because like I said, they don't even do that, even though it's on the cover of the book. They don't even have any email. There's nothing explaining where this comes from. His computer just sparks, and then it stops working properly, and then suddenly it brings something to life. It doesn't make any sense, which is so frustrating, because this is meant to be a story. Everyone even knows that when you tell a story, it's about beginning, middle, end, conflict, resolution. How can you have conflict and resolution when the conflict is, something came to life, and the resolution is, we killed it somehow? That doesn't make any sense. How can you say that this is a good story if that is the basis of your plot? And hey, I could maybe even deal with a surreal story if that's sort of the point of it, sort of about dream logic or something, but this story, if it has a purpose at all, by reading this on a surface level, there's only one potential theme and meaning that I can drag from this, and it seems to be, don't write horror stories. Think about it. That's the whole thing that happens in this story. Kid writes a horror story, it goes crazy, and it decides at the end, hey, the best way is to kill off the guy, and at the end of it, they say, oh, wow, maybe I should finish the story later because it's not done. And he thinks, no, you know what, that's a bad idea. I should instead go play with my friends. What? Okay, I know I'm biased because I'm a horror writer. I obviously have a lot of value in these stories. I think that they matter. And so the fact that there's a story whose main theme seems to be, don't write scary stories, even though it's supposed to be a scary story itself, no, wrong, bad. I think it's obvious by now, but if you hadn't guessed, this book gets an F. But you know, it didn't have to be this way. When I first read the title, blowtorch at psycho.com, I was actually kind of excited. It got my mind whirring as both a reader and a writer, thinking, what could this be about? What could happen in this story? What ended up happening was so bad that I actually feel insulted that a book was so deliberately going against everything that it promised on the cover of the book. But as a writer, I still think that there's a lot of potential here. And so, if you'll follow me for a moment of wild speculation, I'd like to show you what this story could have been, if only briefly. Here's what I'm thinking. Lean into the writer thing more. Have it that he really wants to be a horror author, wants to get published, and he does work on this stuff, but the school doesn't know about it. There's no school thing. Instead, he posts his stories on a website called psycho.com, and in fact, he has one of the top-rated stories on psycho.com, a story he wrote called Blowtorch, and he has told his friend Cambria about it, even though she's not the biggest fan of horror, but she finds it interesting to talk out different ideas with him while she's skating. And I also like the idea that she asks that, eternal question, where do you get your ideas from? And he mentions, oh, well, for this story, I actually got this idea when I read about it in a newspaper. There was actually an arsonist in a nearby town, and it seemed like such a crazy thing to do, burn down a building, so I decided to do the research and wrote a story about that. And we'll throw in a scene introducing BB where she's crushing on him because she liked the poetry that he read in English class a while ago, and he's not really comfortable about it, and so Andrea helps him skate off quickly to his house. But the main conflict of the story is going to be, after he goes online that afternoon, he sees that Psycho.com is running another contest. This time, the winner will have their story published in an actual, real, bound hardback book. And obviously, this really gets him excited, and he notices that he's got a couple of emails that have been sent to him on the website. You know how some of those websites, they have an internal email server, and he got one from someone who's called himself blowtorch at psycho.com, and they say they joined because they read his story and they were such a big fan, they wanted to get in touch with him, and they wanted to know if he was writing for this new contest. So of course he responds and says, yeah, I'd love to. I don't really have a story idea right now, but I would really love to write for this. It sounds like a lot of fun and a big opportunity. And the person says, well, hey, why don't you write another Blowtorch story? he responds by email saying, well, I can't write a story about a bad guy who's in prison. That's not a very interesting story, is it? So of course they say, well, why don't you write the sequel where they break out of prison? Jason thinks that sounds like a pretty cool idea, so he starts thinking about it, starts doing some research. And so we'll have another scene in between where they're talking about his birthday. I think that'd really tie all this stuff together to have an extra scene there. And so he'll then, later he gets online again, he's talking to his friend and says, hey, I think I've come up with an idea, what do you think? And he lays out his idea of how Blowtorch could escape from prison, this step by step. And the other person says, that's brilliant, I think that'll work. I mean, you can even add a little bit how he says, oh, what about the guard here or there? And the guy says, oh, you could just wait for this moment. But yeah, so they discuss the break out of prison thing. And so then we move on, and there's a later scene where Blowtorch at Psycho sends an email saying, hey, so is this sort of a wish fulfillment thing? Do you like the idea of burning stuff? And he says, I don't know, I'm sort of getting in the headspace of this character. And he says, well, if you were them, who would you burn? What would you burn down? And I think he'd start off by saying, oh, well, there's this annoying girl at school, BB, Barbara Burton, she's always harassing me, maybe I'd burn her house down. Well, you know what? No, I think I'd burn the school down as well. Then I wouldn't have to go to school. And so, of course, those things then start happening, don't they? He then goes to school the next day, and Barbara is distraught. They were running out of the house. And so then we'll add that into the story that he'll become closer friends with her as he feels bad for what happened to her, and he wants to find out what happened to her family. And then he realizes that he's emailing the same person who he based the Blowtorch story on. They reached out to him because they thought he was a kindred spirit, that he was an arsonist himself, and that he was a fan of their work. And so then the school will be burnt down, and I think there'll also be a scene later where they'll figure out about his birthday. So we'll sort of throw in the whole thing about online safety. Don't tell people where you'll be, because he'll tell them when his birthday is, and they'll therefore figure out what his name is and where he lives, and because he lives near Barbara Burton, you can sort of throw that in there, and the story would finish off. I don't mind the idea of doing the allergy thing, because to me, even though this is really about the online safety, you could sort of tie in this idea of writers doing their research well, and the idea of flawed characters, how he found out that this original character was allergic to something, and so then when he faces them face to face and they want to attack him and burn his house down with a blowtorch, when he tells them to stop, he's like, you need to stop doing this, like, I know who you are, I know where you live. So then when they attack him at his house, he figures out enough about them to use the allergy against them to stop them, and then he calls the police, and he manages to fight them off until then. Like, I think that could work as the ending to a story, and it's much more interesting than someone's head turning into a balloon. Now, a lot of this stuff is up in the air and vague because I'm not actually writing this story, this is me brainstorming it into something. But whether or not you like that idea in and of itself, surely you can agree that based on the title, blowtorch at psycho.com, surely you'd think that this story is better than the one that I summarized that actually got published. All that being said, there are two things that I think you should take from this book. The first is that any idea could make a great story. And I don't just mean an okay story, a good story. I think any idea could be a great story. Now, obviously, the example I gave, I'm biased because I came up with it, and it's based on the ideas that I like, because that's how my creative process would work. But even you, I'm sure, listening to these different ideas of someone being in contact with a dangerous person and the idea of exploring fiction, you can use these basic concepts to build a good story, and then develop that good story into something great if you set your mind to it. And this matters because there are people out there, there are writers, young writers, who would come up with an idea and they'll try to work on it and they'll think, oh, no, I can't do that. It's a stupid idea. It's a bad idea. And my response is, no. That alone isn't reason to say that it will be a bad story. Obviously, if you think something's a bad idea because it doesn't interest you enough or it doesn't excite you as a writer, then yes, by all means, you don't need to force yourself to create something good from a bad idea. But I don't think an idea alone is enough to determine whether a story will be great or terrible. It's how you build it, how you develop it, how you write it that makes a story great. Never forget that. And the second thing that I think this book teaches us is the importance of proper contextualization. Because as I said, I found it really annoying whenever they brought up the stupid bean burritos, as though, oh, it's scary, it's a bean burrito. And yeah, bean burritos aren't scary. But here's the thing. What this book, I think, was attempting to do was use the context of Blowtorch, the character, to make bean burritos scary. So you see this in a lot of other stories. The first one that comes to mind is Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Our girl, she gets attacked by Freddy Krueger, and then she wakes up and she has his hat. Now, a hat in and of itself is not scary, but it's scary because of the context, because not only is this the hat that belongs to the murderer, but also she woke up and she had it, and so it's come out of her dream into reality. Like, that's scary. So it's taken an item which is mundane, a hat, and then put it in a context which makes it scary. So it's the hat of a serial killing child predator. And different books do this with different icons, and movies love doing this with like musical cues. Even something that sounds cute and sweet can be creepy if it's contextualized as being related to a bad character, being a leitmotif in that vein. And so you could do that in a book, but the reason why it fails so badly in this book is twofold. First of all, they establish early on that beans are a thing that Blowtorch doesn't like. So the association doesn't make any sense. It's like, oh no, beans are here. That's a thing that Blowtorch doesn't eat. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But more importantly, because this book has so many weird, surreal things going on, it doesn't make a lot of sense that it's scary to see these things related, because they are also out of context. It's a teacher eating beans, or it's his mother making chili with onions in it. This doesn't make it scarier because I don't see a direct connection there, and most readers wouldn't. But do you want to see a connection that does work? Well, you need look no further than this book, because they actually achieve it well when he first gets the letter and it's charred on the edges. Without even reading the letter, without it even saying this is from Blowtorch, we know that it's his because of the context that he's associated with burning. We're going to skip aside from the fact that you can't actually burn paper like that using a hairdryer, because obviously it should have been a blowtorch, but do you see what I'm saying? The context can be made scary, and in this case, I think the reason why it's scary to use that as the context is because it's clearly evoking that character without seeing him directly. It's threatening either that he will be there or that he was there in the past. So that's why these contextual clues can be scary. Even something as stupid as a bean burrito can be made scary if you give it the right context. Heck, I could even set that as a challenge for you for your next story. If you want to really, really stretch those writing muscles, pick something that you think is not scary at all. Not scary. And then try to find a context that makes it scary. And I'm not saying like, oh, pick something silly like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and give it teeth. I'm saying find something you don't find scary at all, like jelly beans, or a teddy bear, or even, let's say, an adorable little kitten, right? Imagine a scene where a character walks in and just by seeing this item or animal, they are horrified, right? Imagine that scene and then get the cogs in your head turning and see if you can devise a story that makes that scene make sense, because that is an interesting challenge, and you can show how you need to find a way to turn that into a scary context by developing the story around it and the character or situation that they fear. So that was Blowtorch at Psycho.com. A really, really disappointing story. A frustratingly, insultingly disappointing story. But it still had something we could learn from it. That is the reason why we're here, after all. Thankfully, the next book in this series, from memory, it's another one that's somewhat mid. It's not the most exciting, but it's definitely better than this one. And from memory, it does have some creepy ideas in there. So I look forward to that. But hey, if you thought this was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.